This is the Fire These Times, and I'm your host, Ayoub. Welcome, everyone. This is the Fire These Times. I'm your host, Ayoub, as is the case most times. Today, we'll be talking with Timothée Parrique and Yusra Bitar. Yusra will also be co-hosting, which is this new format that I've been experimenting and which consists of someone also hosting. I'm not very good at explaining things. I'm going to ask both of you, if that's okay, to introduce yourselves. The topic will be degrowth very broadly, but we'll try and get into some of the specifics. And this comes in the back of, or at least a few days after the Beyond Growth conference happened at the EU that I attended. Timothée attended as well, and Timothée spoke there 2 or 3 times, I think, and which was quite surprising. I mean, for me personally, which might speak to my often low expectations, but I was positively surprised by most of it, and some critiques here and there. I'm sure we can get into that as well, but no doubt the significance of that happening in that context is to be noted. And for those listening who have not followed online or have not been there, of course, in Brussels, I will put the link to that conference, which you can just watch the panels and whatnot online anyway. And I was told, or at least they told us there, that there's going to be also like a bunch of resources and whatnot released on that website. So it's cool to just keep your eyes out. Anyway, let's start with some intros, if that's okay. Timothée, you're our guest, so maybe you can go first, and Yusra, you can go after that.
Fantastic, everyone. Hello. So Timothée Parrique, if you want the perfect French pronunciation. I'm a researcher in ecological economics, currently at the School of Economics and Management of Lund University in the southwest of Sweden. And I wrote my PhD dissertation, which ended up being titled The Political Economy of Degrowth. That's from 2019, which is really a broad, wide, and atrociously long theoretical work whose aim was really to define what is degrowth and what are its economic implications. I've been translating that work into a shorter French book, not yet in English, soon in German and Spanish, and then I hope English. And now I'm conducting research on the issue of decoupling and the impossibility of green growth, and the financing of welfare systems without economic growth.
Hello, my name is Yusra. I am a research fellow at the Arab Reform Initiative in their environmental politics program. I'm also a post-growth affiliate fellow. I joined as a fellow last year, and I'm also someone that researches degrowth and how it applies to the Middle East region. And last year I wrote a piece on degrowth in the Lebanon context and what degrowth within the realm of economic collapse means, and what the ideation can mean, and what the difference between the recession we're experiencing is right now and how it differs from degrowth, but how much we can build off of what's coming out within the cracks of the collapse transition. And I've used Timothée's work for that piece, so thank you for that.
Okay, well, awesome. Thank you both for those intros. Yeah, I remember Yusra's piece because it included that meme that Timothée you shared some time ago on Twitter, I think, of the mountain bike going down and the difference between degrowth and a recession. Because Yusra, I don't know, do you want to introduce that as well? I think it's a good anchor to this conversation.
Yeah, sure. So just to give a bit of context, there has been an economic crisis in Lebanon since 2018, although arguably the roots of it are decades old. And that has translated to hyperinflation, and the hyperinflation has meant an inability to access particular resources that maintain a particular standard of living, and in addition to accessing electricity, accessing healthcare, etc. In the context of the piece, what I was experiencing was extremely dark streets, just like everybody else in the country, because there was no money to purchase fuel to fuel the electricity grid. It was basically me in the context of very dark streets and walking with a friend who has heard me blab about degrowth for years, and he told me basically, "Are you happy now? This is happening. Degrowth is here. this is degrowth, you got degrowth. So that statement was like him teasing, but it was also one of the narratives that we know very well in the, as thinkers of degrowth, that recession and degrowth are the same. Degrowth implies the opposite of prosperity. And I just wrote the piece to explain what the difference is, but also seeing what solutions coming up as a response to the catastrophe could be, create an alternative. So some examples I gave were some initiatives stemming out in different parts of Lebanon that were creating a food sovereignty network, for example, to create a sustainable food system. Another is the shift to renewables as a response, like a faster shift. There was some form of transition to solar and like wind energy, but it wasn't happening as fast as it was in the past since the collapse and since the hyper necessity of immediate energy access. So yeah, and another example I gave was the renewable initiatives happening all over the country, but making sure the idea that this needs to be implemented on a policy level and not like haphazard initiatives here and there for those who have the material ability to initiate those alternatives.
I asked you to kind of bring us into this conversation with that example, just because this won't be a Lebanon specific episode. Of course, we did one previously, which hasn't been released yet, Yusra and I, with JD Harlock, which I'll release at some point, and I'm sure we'll do others at some point, focusing on the global south more broadly. But this kind of tendency, I call it almost like a reflex, and something definitely that I have personally experienced as well, of like, you say the word degrowth, and for those who, well, in many cases, like, what are you talking about? In other cases, it would be like just an assumption of scarcity, right? The image of scarcity comes into people's minds, or a lot of people's minds anyway. And of course, the idea of degrowth and post-growth is actually post all of that, post-scarcity thinking, we might say post-scarcity economics. Timothée, would you mind you published your PhD in 2019. In many ways, like the timing was pretty good for unfortunate reasons when it comes to COVID in 2020. And this idea of degrowth being, I think, arguably at the very least, being taken more and more seriously in quote unquote mainstream thought. What has your experience on that been? What can you share with us? And I know, and I should say, like, this is also in the back of a post that you published yesterday. Today is May 22nd, 2023, I should say, as a response to The Economist, because they covered that Beyond Growth conference in a rather ridiculous way, I should say. But yeah, feel free to take it from there if you want.
Yeah, that piece from The Economist, it was titled something like "Meet the Lefty Europeans Who Want to Deliberately Shrink the Economy." And the first thing is that exactly what you guys were talking about, is to be like, oh, look, but there is no more growth in Europe. You should be happy. I mean, I point to Italy, which has been what we macroeconomists call secular stagnation. So very low or stagnant rates of economic growth, famously also happening in Japan for a few decades. And so they're like, you should, that's the utopia you're calling for, which is, well, we should be worried about this in a way, because, you're a journalist reporting on a conference where you have 5,000 people, including all the world experts that work on the topic, and you don't even manage to understand the kind of first thing about the concept, which it's pretty worrying. But the way I usually explain it is to really make the difference because recessions and degrowth have something in common. That thing in common is a reduction of production and consumption. But during a recession, that reduction is like accidentally. And when I say accidentally, is that it's undesired. So it comes with deleterious social outcomes like unemployment, austerity, poverty, a lack of investment even in environmental project, all of that. Degrowth, on the other hand, the way the concept is discussed by academists and activists, describes a planned, selective, and equitable downskilling of economic activities. So here you can really make the difference. Recession, unplanned and unwanted. Degrowth, designed and desired. And my favorite analogy to really make the difference is the following: is, that's what I wrote in the piece that I published yesterday. So a response to The Economist, "Shut up and let me grow," where I explain that I say associating degrowth with a recession just because the two involve a reduction of GDP is absurd. It would be like arguing that an amputation and a diet are the very same thing just because they both lead to weight loss. And so science is complex. We are using a concept that mean more than what they say in the word. So when you say degrowth, it's not only degrowing everything, in the same way that when you say communism, is not putting everything in common, or when you say sustainable development, it does mean sustainably developing everything. So there's a bit of a subtlety, especially for a concept that has been existing since 2002 at least. So yeah, we really need, and I think that's our responsibility as an expert of the topic to explain, but it's also the responsibility of journalists, when you attend a conference, to kind of cover what is being said. So you're right, like this piece published by The Economist is not really a critique, it's a sneer. It's just to say like, oh, a bunch of, leftist radicals have hijacked the parliament for 3 days and they're going to talk of nonsensical ideas. I mean, what they say, like he calls it like a pretty wacky growth as the root of all problem jamboree among a cast of minor academics, which is kind of funny, a cast of minor academics like Joseph Stiglitz, Vandana Shiva, Johan Rockström, Kate Raworth, Rash Patel, like these giants respected by everyone, even outside of heterodox economics. I mean, even who economists would dare calling Joseph Stiglitz a minor scholar?
It says a lot. No, I have so many thoughts. And Yusra, you can also jump in, of course. But I still find it a bit baffling that this is it's still a common attitude, I guess we might say, of a lot of people in the economics world, whether they are themselves economists or maybe journalists who write on econ, or maybe a financial journalists or whatnot, of this idea that even questioning growth as a model, like questioning GDP, for example, economic growth specifically, and GDP often is almost like it's not just taboo, it's like almost beyond taboo. It's like it's too ridiculous to even comprehend. Like it's almost you're committing a blasphemy, in many ways. And it does feel a bit, I use blasphemy, of course, purposefully, because it feels almost like there's this religious tenet, or a number of them, like, a number of commandments. And the first one is thou shall not, criticize economic growth or whatnot. And I find it still baffling. Maybe I shouldn't. Maybe I should be like more, I don't know, sober about this, if that's the right term. But I still find it interesting that someone can go to a conference like this one, which as you mentioned was pretty varied as well. Like there were even some folks who were green growthers, quote unquote, who were not very popular. And you had some, the first speakers included Ursula von der Leyen herself, and there's who I have a lot of critiques of. But like it wasn't like an Occupy camp where it's just mostly people who already agree with one another, which is a cliche and it's not always true either. But it wasn't even that, right? It was pretty straightforward as to what this conference was about and what it was going to explore and try and develop. And the plenaries were pretty different from one another at times. And there's quite a lot to get out of, almost regardless of what your original take might be. Like there's something for you there. And that I think was one of the strengths of that conference. But anyway, Yusra?
I mean, I agree with what you're saying, but for me, I think it's interesting when I talk about degrowth and the tenets of degrowth with people here at home here, and like explaining the where it comes from and how it's a true response to the climate catastrophe. I think there's a constant reminder that this is what we're dealing with in relation to the changing climate. There's more of an acceptance, and I've personally found it to be rare that there's the same kind of response or rigidness in relation to growth here, at least. And I think it's probably because in the past few years we haven't really been growing, and when it comes to the measurements of GDP and whatever. So I think there's also a very lived experience to what recession looks like and what happens when there is a recession in relation to the growth. And I think maybe that could be why. different viewing of the same issue, and I just feel like there's more of a responsiveness here, despite the fact that the rest of the world, the so-called global north, is more responsible for shrinking, so the rest of the world can breathe.
Yeah, there's a different attitude of, at the very least, from the examples I think that we're more familiar with, of this idea of like you just need to be realistic, quote unquote, about the reality of economic growth is not. It's not exactly tenable if you're in a situation where you haven't benefited as much, or at all for that matter, from that framework, because as the conference did get into, I should say, like a number of times, it has been mostly a one-way situation with capital and labor and whatnot being produced for the global north. Of course, this is an oversimplification. There are nuances within the global south as well, but as a general trend, this is definitely true. Timothée, you've mentioned, in your speech, but at the conference, at least the one I attended, but also a number of times, you've described situations, right, like what growth in already rich countries, like they've mentioned, the economist mentioned, and I don't want to give that piece too much air, to be honest, but as a symptomatic example of this kind of attitude, I think that we're familiar with, which is a very unserious one. We should say, like, this is not a serious argument. There are serious arguments within the degrowth and post-growth movement that allow for a lot of nuance as to how to do something, where to do it, when, and that sort of thing. But arguments like these ones, I don't think are very serious. So I mean, you already did a response to it, right? So this is not going to be just another one. And I will link to your piece in the show notes as well. But you've described situations where, already rich countries like Italy, like Japan, haven't really been growing in that GDP sense in a while now. And despite that, there's still, it's almost like an obsession. I mean, that term was also repeated a number of times at the Beyond Growth conference, an obsession with GDP, an obsession with economic growth. And you've argued, of course, that this obsession has generated more costs than benefits. And can you flesh that out a bit, if that's okay with you? Because this is still something that I think emotionally still resonates, even with a lot of people, at least in my experience, that in theory wouldn't really disagree with the premise of what we are arguing here, but kind of feel again like, oh, this feels a bit too unrealistic or too utopic or too whatnot. What is it about that assumption that it gets fundamentally wrong, if I could put it that way?
There's a concept I like from American economist Herman Daly, which is the concept of uneconomic growth. And Herman Daly calls uneconomic growth that extra production, that growth that bears more social ecological cost than financial benefits. So what I like is when we talk about economic growth at the macroeconomic level, we tend, the discussion gets very abstract. And so we fall within that obsession. So what some people have called growthism, or the ideology of growth, where we assume that everything should forever exponentially increase. But imagine you're the owner of a small bakery and you're just making bread. And in doing so, let's say you're selling your bread. And if you're thinking about, well, you're starting up, you don't have enough customers, you've not reached what microeconomists would say an optimal scale, where you can sell enough bread just to be in balance, and you can pay the rent for your place, you can pay your workers the factors of production, whatever. Okay, so then you might be in a bit of a upscaling mentality, a bit of a growth mentality. Okay, how do you reach that scale? But then imagine putting yourself in a situation where you need to exponentially sell more every year. Like, after some point, you're going to realize that if you want to do this, first you will need to work more. So we realize the first trade-off we have. It's true at the micro scale, it's true at the meso scale, it's true at the macro national scale. It never disappears. A day was, is, and will forever be 24-hour long. If you want to sell more bread, you will have to just focus on that. Maybe you'll have to open another place. Maybe you'll have to hire more people. That means more time. And if you want to do this, you'll need to just, make your oven function longer. You would need more flour and more bread and more, raw materials. And so your material footprint will increase, because you cannot make bread out of nothing. In that very small experience of what should be considered, like a very instinctive economic activity, we understand that labor time, energy, and materials are the real limiting factors of the growth of any economic activity. And these are not present in that overall discourse about economic growth. And I just want to point, now I'm writing a second piece that I'll be publishing at the end of the week, where I analyze the 5 speeches of the people that came from the European Commission, which all showed perfect example of, we want economic growth, we need to make it green, sustainable, whatever you guys hippie want, but we won't give up growth, because growth is progress, growth is the future, growth is modernity, growth is civilization. And then I realized that this is just, it shows like both a misunderstanding of what growth is on the result side of things. So first, like, yeah, if that extra income doesn't ends up in the pocket of those that are already rich, it has no effect on well-being. Actually, it increases inequality, and since inequality is correlated to unwell-being, we know that it will decrease quality of life. And same thing, if that income drives inequality, but also the stuff you produce are not really necessary production. Let's say you're going to create a lot of bullshit firms doing marketing to sell stuff you didn't need it in the first place. That's a lot of economic agitation, but for literally zero well-being. And so if economic growth right now in these high-income countries that are so desperate to stimulate their economy, they are just refusing to accept the fact that sometime your economy reaches an optimal scale. We are like, here, you know what? We're good. We don't want to work more. We don't want to mobilize more energy and materials because we can't, and because we will need these materials in other countries. And we also have enough if we organize ourselves equitably, intelligently, to just be content, to be satisfied, to be sufficient. So these kind of mentality of sufficiency is you could say, the opposite of the spectrum of the infinite ideology of growth.
And would this lead us to what you've you and others have called a steady state economy?
Yeah, I like to link it up to be like degrowth is a transition towards a steady state economy. So if you picture a country like France, Germany, Sweden, the US, Australia, countries whose productive capacities, whose levels of production and consumption are so beyond the carrying capacities of their ecosystems, we realize that you cannot green that. You will not be able to green it. Even if you have no growth, even if you just maintain these levels, you won't be able to get back within safe planetary boundaries. The only way to make it work is to reduce production and consumption. So you do so until you manage to get back within your biocapacity. And once you're there, then you stabilize, you change, you've done your diet. Now you're back into full health. You know that this infrastructure, like the use of energy, labor time, and materials won't be able to grow forever. You can, it can change a bit. It can oscillate. That the dynamic concept of steady-state economy is not an economy that is stagnant or that has stopped, like a game of musical chairs. No, it's rather something that within the same material infrastructure manages to focus on quality activities, on well-being as an objective, which we know from social science does not derive from the quantity of stuff you own. It derives from the quality of experiences you have. So you can have, 12 cars in your garage, but if you have no friends, you'll be miserable. You can have no car, a bunch of bikes if you have many friends, and you can go and have picnics and the time to nap and go to the theaters and whatever, play music with your friends. You'll be the happiest human on earth. So if that's true, if we know this from psychology, from sociology, from anthropology, why are we wiring our economies to just churn out a maximum, an increasingly maximum amount of goods and services that requires an increasing amount of hours that we should and could spend doing other things?
Yeah, I mean, you can't see me, but I'm just nodding along. Okay. You also suggested that the real limiting factor, or at least a bunch of people have as well suggested, is in transitioning to. Actually, let me backtrack a bit. This idea of sustainability, right? Like the very idea of to be sustained sounds very good, of course, and in principle, of course, it's a good thing. But what is it? Maybe I don't know if this is repeating yourself, so feel free to take it to a different direction if you want. But what is it about the term sustainable development in the way it is usually framed that kind of feels, if I can put it this way, as an oxymoron?
I can start by saying very quickly that the term décroissance in French came as a critique of sustainable development back in 2002. So the people that coined décroissance conviviale, convivial degrowth, they were criticizing sustainable development as being a Western capitalistic growth obsessed paradigm. A paradigm that instead of touching the root of the problem was actually trying to green an imperialist global form of unsustainable exploitation. And we see this today. I mean, you look at these sustainable development goals and you're like, okay, cool. Hunger, education, why not climate? Yeah, water. Yeah, we like this. And then you're like, SDG 8. Yeah, economic growth. I was like, what is this about? We're completely confusing the means. Agitating your economy is not an end in itself. It's not a goal. It's a mean. You agitate your economy, you mobilize labor, time, and materials just to produce something that you need. And then you use that thing, that bike, to go from A to B. That's mobility. And then you derive some satisfaction from that. And the satisfaction can be, liberty, can be access to health, healthy food, all that stuff. That's the goal we should be measuring. Economic growth should not be a goal. So today, I think the degrowth and post-growth discourse, it provides a more sophisticated vision of sustainability because it allows you to talk about differentiated responsibility and so differentiated lines of action. To summarize it, if you take countries in overshoot in the global north, they should degrow. If that is the case, well, better plan it democratically so it can be a just and convivial degrowth, so they degrow to a steady state. And countries in the global south who find themselves in a situation where they still have a lot of unmet needs, they can have access to energy, matter, and labor time so that they can upskill. You see, I'm trying not to use grow because grow involves this kind of linear infinite. They can just upscale, develop the kind of productive capacity they need to reach sufficiency. And both these trajectories meet in the middle in a sustainable, steady state where everyone can satisfy their needs under planetary boundaries.
It's not to add too much, but I think the challenge for me when I think of sustainable development and what development means and what the measurement of development means, it always brings up the same images for people. It's often images of a city or image of like a lot of activity, and I just find it I think in terms of like the dominant ideation or like dominant idea of what progress means is still there, and trying to find a way to create alternative images so that's more of a commonality. And with that, I going back to what you've been working on a lot, Timothée, these days on green growth and the fallacy of green growth. Why can't growth not be green? Is there no way that economic growth can take into consideration ecological laws and still somewhat grow?
Well, I would say no. Well, there's three ways of approaching this. The strongest rebuttal is, and this I think is consensual now, is that all experiences we've seen of growth in the past has never been within planetary boundaries, in the sense of if you take a multi-impact perspective, you take into account not only carbon emissions, but soil, impact on biodiversity, freshwater use, emissions of pollutants, material footprint, all of that, we realize that when you produce and consume more, that put a strain on these resources. That derives from a very simple biophysical truth, which is the fact that no economic activity is possible without time, energy, and materials. Everything requires a human. Even the most dematerialized service will require someone that will need to eat food, be warm, wear clothes, and move themselves to go to work. So this is why you can, let's say, decouple to a certain extent certain things. If you produce services instead of heavy industry, of course, you're going to have different impact, and that overall impact can be lower. It can be lower, but it cannot be null. And if it cannot be null, it means that if you keep growing your economy, necessarily, mathematically, unavoidably, at some point, your total impact will have overbalanced the efficiency impact of, each of the thing you produced. And this is what we see historically in all countries in the world that we've been looking at in all the empirical studies we have on decoupling, which is almost 1,000 studies. And then that's the first part, looking at the past. Then some people could say, yeah, but in the future is already there. So what we need, when the Europe say Fit for 55 means reducing emissions by 55% by 2030. That's in the coming 7 years. So then it's also second part of the argument to show that even if green growth was theoretically possible, I will soon show that it's not, and I've done so a bit before, but that it would be foolish to think that it is feasible because it involves a speeding up of all the things that allow us to just have this bit of decoupling to a point that is unrealistic, especially since certain impacts have not even started to decouple, even in the most progressive in terms of environmental policies countries in the world. Then the only way to have green growth at this point would be to completely change the way we measure economic growth. And then there's no point because economic growth is supposed to be a measure of production and consumption. And so statistically, we could just do a bit of stats magics and, start counting certain things that we did not include before. And that means GDP will be bigger and would feel like growth, but it's stupid because, the goal today for sustainability is to decrease environmental use, the use of natural resources. This is what needs to go down. When we talk of green growth, we focus on the wrong end of the stick because we're like, yeah, we want to grow and we want to do it as green as possible. No, actually, it's not, green growth. It's a growth green. That's stupid, but actually, what's important is the green. What we need is green. And again, the problem with the other problem with green growth, even if you were to show that it has been happening before, and so therefore we expect it as feasible to happen in the near future, and it is theoretically possible to completely decouple, so that's a viable strategy for sustainability. Even if you manage to do this, I've been looking at this since 2018 every day, and I've not found a single person on Earth that managed to put together that proof. And I've been looking. Even if you were to do this, then you still face this very powerful argument of why would you want to go through so much effort just to produce and consume stuff that are not needed because they're completely decorrelated from quality of life?
Yeah, I've also been nodding along. This is not very good audio content. So you've mentioned that at the end of this week you're going to be publishing a piece on responding to those who from the European Commission. I'm very curious if you can kind of give us a bit of a maybe preview of that. As I said, this episode might be released sooner than your piece or might be released after. In either case, I'll try and remember to put it in the show notes. And also more specifically, I know, or in addition to that, maybe, I know that within the conference of Beyond Growth at the European Parliament in Brussels, those 3 days that we attended, there were people, there was even a panel that I don't know which one, so I can't say for sure. I was not there, to be clear, but I have been told was a bit cringy, is a quote of a friend who attended, of having a debate, and I'm putting this in quotation, between the positions of degrowth, post-growth, and green growth. And that was how it was framed, which I find a bit bizarre. It kind of, not just that panel, but there were a few people here and there who, including Ursula von der Leyen herself, who were basically saying that this is possible. And it's almost, again, I'm repeating this whole religious aspect a bit, but it kind of feels a bit like a mantra. You repeat it enough time, and maybe if you say it 100 times, it becomes true. And on the other side, you have all of these climate scientists and ecological economists and all of these other folks who are saying this is the data, this is why this cannot work. And also, it actually makes a lot of sense as to why this might not work. And here is 1,000 examples of things that you, Ursula, or you, all of these other folks would also agree with, like the example of the baker, for example. I don't think many people disagree with these fundamental examples, but somehow when you imagine a scaling up, okay, yeah, sure, this can work. I'm imagining this conversation, this can work in an economy or in a neighborhood level, or this can work within the family or whatnot. But when you have to scale up, you have to take all of these other things into consideration. And somehow this translates itself into some kind of, GDP-oriented economic growth and whatnot. Anyway, that was a bunch of stuff I threw at you, so feel free to pick what you want.
The panel you're referring to is the focus panel 1 that happened on May 15. It was in the morning. You can watch the replay, and it was a call "Which Prosperous Future: Confronting Narratives of Growth," where they were, discussing like degrowth versus green growth. And there was Michael Jacobs, professor of political economy at in Sheffield, the University of Sheffield in the UK, and he was the one representing green growth. So you guys can have a look at this and make yourself an opinion. There's also a very good debate between Sam Franke-Auser and Jason Hickel, moderated by Kate Raworth at the University of Oxford, I think from early this year. And I find like first, when we compare these two, there's the scientific aspect of just, I think the burden of proof should be on the one believing that we can do something that we've never done. Very often, these people, they will tell you, but look, we've never done degrowth either. So you have to prove that it works. And I'm like, that's silly. I mean, do I need to mathematically demonstrate that if you don't fly a plane, you don't emit the emissions compared to someone that argues we can fly more planes and emit less? I'm like, no. It's like you're a flat earther. If you're a flat earther, the burden of proof is on you. You have to show us that your theory is stronger than these kind of, the earth is round. So green growthers here, they're just unjustly, I think, passing the burden of proof on degrowther, where what we argue is a very strong commonsensical argument. The most sustainable resource is the one you don't need to use. And again, we've seen this historically also during COVID. Lockdown is a very good way of reducing environmental pressures. That's more of an amputation-like strategy. But we should explore the possibility of recreating the same consequences, but in a convivial, more just, and more democratic fashion. So the first thing that comes to mind, and the second comment is just that the narratives don't have the same depth. Green growth is not a utopia. When I debate green growth with usually only economists and entrepreneurs defend this view, or officials, and we'll come back to the few examples of the European Commission. But it's not a utopia. It's people saying, oh, let's keep doing what we do, and it can be green if you had a carbon tax. I mean, literally, it's only this. You can watch the debate between Sam and Jason Hickel, and you'll see the only thing Sam is advocating for is put a tax on carbon. That will change behaviors, and that'll phase out, fossil fuels. And I'm like, this is your solution? It sounds a bit like, one bullet, one ring to rule them all. Whereas if you look at degrowth, you have a diversity of strategies and policies. And an article we wrote with Nick Fitzpatrick, published in 2022, we identify 380 instruments in the degrowth literature. And degrowth is connected to other utopia like solar punk and eco-socialism and social and solidarity economy and the commons-based economy. And so it's a much richer paradigm, whereas green growth is just basically trying to just decarbonize the economy. That's what they've done. They've not even looked at other environmental impact. There's no one in the green growth discourse has anything to say about biodiversity, for example. It's just a blind spot. You tell biodiversity to an economist, they'll look at you like you're an idiot. Like, are you talking about my dog? Yeah, I like my dog. We walk in the park on Sunday. But what this has to do with the economy? I'm like, this is what the economy is, animals, energy, labor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know, Yusra, you wanted to ask a question. I'll quickly just say before that, if that's okay, that what this sort of tells me, as in like the image that comes to mind, is that the economists, policymakers, and others who are sort of trying to square that circle or circle that square, whatever, is that they have the answer that they want, and they're just trying to fit the question or to fit the framework or whatnot to try and squeeze in that answer. And that's just not how science works. We may have a suggestion or a hint or something like, oh, we think this might be the case, but we still need to test it against the evidence. And if the evidence doesn't kind of stack up, well, we change the conclusion. We don't change the evidence.
Yeah, and also just listening to you speak, it just makes me really wonder, is it a question of ideology? And as you were saying, like trying to fit the square into a circle that is already there? Is it the unwillingness to understand the severity of the climate catastrophe? Is it fear of accountability at some point for those who are still benefiting from fossil fuel? Like, I really do not comprehend this rigidity to stick in working as usual, given the severity of the crisis. It's just like it's just difficult to accept as a playing field, despite the fact that there has been a lot of progress.
It probably feels like all of the above, right?
Yeah, but with that said, there has been a lot of progress when it comes to shifting more people to thinking of post-growth and degrowth. I think for me, I'm curious more about, Timothée, when it comes to your work or your conversations in your network, when it comes to, again, in quotations, the global south, or in contrast to the global north, in relation to degrowth. And because as we said before, it is an idea that came that the so-called developed countries need to shrink for the rest of the world to grow. But I do wonder if more conversations of how that relates to the rest of the world have been coming up, like conversations on degrowth in the Middle East, for example, or I don't know, just in general.
Yeah, and the first theorist of degrowth in France was Serge Latouche, who wrote Le Pari de la décroissance in 2006. And Serge Latouche, was first a rather mainstream economist, and he did his PhD thesis fieldwork in Africa, in Congo. And, that's where he got the idea of degrowth, because it's like, well, this development strategy is just pure social ecological exploitation. It's pure accumulation by dispossession and accumulation by deterioration. So we're calling it growth, but actually it's just, enslaving the global south for the interest of an imperial mode of living in the global north. And we dare calling it economic growth, even though even the benefits of that are not just increasing quality of life and are so unevenly spread, even within the north. So he came back being like, wow, this development paradigm is really an imperialism. And so he likes in his book to always remind that, his thoughts on degrowth started in the global south. It was not a reflection of, like shopping malls in Luxembourg and the experience of consumerism in the north. It was rather starting from the impact of these lifestyles and kind of like a detective tracing back. Well, why are we extracting so many minerals in Africa? Now, are we exporting them? What do we do with that and that and that? And then, you link to planned obsolescence, another topic he spent all his life working on, as a way of connecting these two, like the development perspective to enslave the global south to become like all-you-can-eat buffets for the rich of the global north, that then, for-profit capitalist companies using planned obsolescence to just, make profits out of creating a dependency of consumers towards always replacing their phones and computers every year. And, that gave him a systemic perspective of that whole growth as an ideology and as a phenomenon of exploitation, which is, it's a critique of development and a critique of capitalism, but the prism of growth, I think, is very powerful, because it's a discourse today that is so important. So when we talk about degrowth, wow, the media are getting railed up. The Economist feels like it needs to kind of defend its ground. If you were to call about critique of capitalism, they'll be, it's just another Marxist, like there are many. So I think there's a bit of novelty in this. And now you're right, like the concept of degrowth, so it was translated in English in 2008. Before that, it was very European. So it was very present in Italy, in Catalonia, in Spain, in Belgium, in Quebec. But then when it gets translated in English, it moves to other countries. And now it's even just moving beyond. I mean, I've got, activists and scholars that are just very active in these circles. They are just from South America, from some parts of India, some people in other countries that where they connected with other discourses. Can be Buen Vivir in South America, Ubuntu in Africa, can be Eco-Swaraj in India. So there's a bit of this convergence. That's some scholars, they call it a pluriverse of concept. So in, around the Mediterranean in Western Europe, we have this décroissance, degrowth, but then that connects with the voluntary simplicity of the people in Quebec, and maybe the minimalism of some people in the US, and then the buen vivir on people in the South America, and other concepts, each in their context, that share a number of values, can be, a certain relation to nature, sufficiency, justice, care, all these kind of stuff. So that's why you can include them into a pluriverse of shared values. And what they have in common also is their contestation, their criticism of global capitalism as a system of exploitation. So that's also what brings them together, and that makes it into a very strong, like Avenger-like alliance. And I think this conference at the Parliament, we've seen the diversity of this concept, which is not a competition to know which concept is best. It actually makes us realize that the thing we criticize is more specific than we thought. It's not human nature, it's not demography, it's something very specific. It is growth, obsessed forms of profit-seeking capitalism based on a very particular and culturally situated relation with nature that is both, imperialistic, commodifying, and all of that. So I think it's a good way of realizing that here there is no risk of degrowth becoming a new imperialism. So becoming basically the new sustainable development, where now instead of trying to just grow sustainably and having these goals, we will have, sustainable degrowth goals, and we'll impose it to everyone in the world. It's rather a shut up button to global capitalism, being like, guys, just shut up and let the pluriverse live.
I love this idea of the pluriverse. I attended a kind of like a summer school last summer in Coimbra in Portugal, called that the summer school. I think it was called Pluriverse Summer School or something along those lines at the University of Coimbra. And yeah, it was largely Spanish-speaking oriented. There were quite a lot of Latin Americans, and that sort of vision in many ways wasn't as much like, oh, here is this thing that has been cooked up in the global north. What do you think about it? It was more like, it seems that the sciences of ecological economics, climate science, and whatnot are coming to terms with, responding to the pressing needs of the present moment, the pressing needs of the present moment, yeah. And but there are these other frameworks, worldviews, especially when it comes to indigenous politics in Latin America, for example, or what is called Latin America, that have sort of reached an equilibrium, if we can call it that, or at least have advocated for an equilibrium for much longer periods of time. And now it's more about like, how can we find ways to link all of these up and accept a pluriverse rather than a one-size-fits-all model, which we think everyone should do or whatnot. Like that has always been part of the problem anyway. This is not a amazing segue, but you discussed the idea of like universal basic services, and I think many folks, if not most folks listening to this, have heard of UBI, right? Like universal basic income, and maybe they would have heard of like a jobs guarantee kind of framework. I forgot the technical term for it, but like, how does this? Can you put those three in conversation, if that makes sense?
So these are part of like the many policies being discussed to both organize degrowth as a temporary phase and then post-growth, so the more long-term running of a growth-less economy. And of course, that remains an economy, so you have to just take care of welfare provision, which is the ability of people to access the goods and services they need to satisfy certain needs. Mainly when you're hungry, you want to have access to food. If you cannot, you're in an economy that sucks, and that doesn't work. And so universal basic services is basically facilitating access to a certain basket of goods and services. So when I say facilitating, I need to tell a bit more. Like today, we live in a predominantly capitalist society where most of these goods and services are commodified. When I say commodified, it means they are market commodity. If you want to have access to them, you need to buy them, okay? If you want a bike, you need to buy one. You go to the shop, you give them money, and they give it to you. You don't have the money, you don't have the bike. You want to live in a city, you have to pay a rent. you want to buy food, you have to give money. So the problem is, if you live in a society where you don't have enough money, or if you live in a society that undergoes a degrowth transformation where some people have less money, then you're going to find yourself in a strain and you're going to have unmet needs, which is not good. So what about collectively, we take care of some of these services like we already do for education and healthcare? To be, instead of US style, you go to the hospital and you want to have something you need to pay, you don't have the money, you don't get. We say there's a social guarantee of access to healthcare. So we've been developing this in many welfare states. So the question is just to expand it to be, look, maybe housing, energy, telecommunication, all these kind of stuff, they should be guaranteed rights of access. And then when it comes to financing, that should be collectively organized, not by individual users through their purchasing power, but through our collective purchasing power. So that here you can see the relation between UBI, basic income, and UBS, basic services. UBI is a more market solution because I give you money, you do whatever you want. But if you live in a capitalist society where all these goods and services are sold by for-profit companies that use every single opportunity to, push up their prices, I'll give you dollars or euros and you'll just give to these companies. They'll make profits. They'll give it to very rich people that will just reinvest it into more privatization of these public infrastructure and more environmental degradation. So it doesn't really work. So UBS is a very good way of making sure that you give access to goods and services. And by doing so, you preserve access to this. There is no monetary leakage. There's also a middle ground, which you give a basic income in an alternative currency. So not the euros, not the dollar, not Bitcoin, but some local green currency with whom you can only buy certain things or that can be delimitated to a certain territory. So you're sure that the green euro you're using here is not, leaking to the financial sector or anywhere else in a tax haven. So that's about these two. Then I'm going to talk about the job guarantee, but just very quick. You cannot talk about the job guarantee without talking about work time reduction. I think these two that just go together. And the way it works is if you want to contract production and consumption in an economy, you're going to just contract the amount of hours you spend working. And so one good way of avoiding unemployment, which is undesirable currently, is to share the available time better. So instead of, if you have to produce, let's say, half less, so you produce 50%, instead of firing half of your people, and then you have, half of the population working full-time, half of the population working zero time, being miserable, then you put everyone part-time. We all work 50%. We are all employed. You keep your colleagues, keep your workspace, and then we have more free time. Macroeconomically, there is no difference between these two scenarios. But socio-politically, we clearly see that we would prefer to live in a society where everyone has access to employment, because that's also an important social function. So work time reduction is a very good reactive policy to avoid brutal, undesirable unemployment. It's also something we should treat as a goal. Working less towards the very long time, that's what an economy is for, to liberate free time to do stuff you can basically autonomously decide what to do with. And then job guarantee articulates with this, because the problem today is, I've talked of commodification. Labor itself has been commodified. So for-profit companies today, commercial companies, they're the one paying you to do stuff. They're the one creating jobs mostly, if we're not talking about public jobs. And they're creating jobs only for activities that are lucrative. And so that predetermines what kind of jobs exist. So a lot of jobs we would like to have, people specialized in ecological reconstruction, people specialized in satisfying unmet needs when it comes to, creating new medicine for people that need it, or just doing all the childcare and elderly care we don't have enough people doing today, that won't be created, because all the hours will be focused on, doing marketing and bullshit jobs and jobs in the financial sectors and in the banking sectors and stuff that might not be necessary. So the job guarantee basically is guaranteeing access to a job as a right. So that's the first thing. But then in the way it's being organized in practice, it gives the community, can be the state, can be the territory. In the job guarantee I like, and the one that we are currently experimenting in France, it happens at the municipality level, where we decide, okay, everyone has access to a job. If you cannot find a job in the labor market. If no companies will hire you, then we will work with you finding one of your aspiration, one of the stuff you want to do with the skills you currently have. We will find a way of matching this to an unmet need. And that's something that happens outside of the market. It's a political decision. And what we've seen on the ground is that the jobs being created, most of them, they are focusing on social care and ecological needs, stuff that are not fulfilled today by for-profit kind of jobs being created by commercial firms.
Yeah, this is excellent. Thank you so much. I don't really have another question, but as you were speaking, I was just, again, trying to think of how this applies to, the Swana, the MENA region, especially given that most of the states here are autocratic and hyper-dependent, like the Emirates, like Saudi. There's a lot of hyper consumerism, like they're the tip of it. And how that relates to the demands of people over the past few decades, and thinking about how most of the demands fall within the frameworks of universal basic services. Like at the core of it, it's about liberation, freedom, but also access to healthcare, access to green spaces, access just to the ability to breathe. And there is an overlap between the two, and thinking of the pluriverse in this region. They're interesting to think about them as well, and how these solutions that you're proposing come within in the context of autocratic decadent regimes. So thank you for that. Very interesting.
And I'm going to say something very naive. That seems very naive, but I think it remains true. Again, we saw that there's this divide between something that is true at the microeconomic level, with the example of the baker, that we make the experience of that limitedness every day. That if you want to do more, you need to find more factors of production. So it never disappears. There's something else that never disappears. So I was just imagining you're organizing a picnic with your friends, or you're going somewhere on holiday, and you're just making food, and someone just forgot to bring some food. What are you going to do? You're going to be like, well, you don't eat. That's how it works, No, you're going to share the food fairly, equitably, and then, we're going to just make it work. We're humans. That's what we do. We'll find an arrangement that works. So all the micro experience within the family, within friendship, within the municipality, with the people, in your street, anthropologically for thousands of years, they've been based on this, okay, we do this fairly, we try to make it work. And now, weirdly, at the macroeconomic level, we reach a situation where we have organized a system where if you don't have money, you don't eat. If you don't have money, you don't live anywhere. If you don't have, certain skills, you don't work. If you don't have skills that for-profits company want, you don't work, which is a very weird anthropological outcome. We would never run a small event, a small anything. We would never run it like this. So the fact that we have an economy with these kind of rules that emerge at the macroeconomic shows us that we really need to rewire the software we use to run our economies.
Yeah, definitely. And again, going back to that, we would not act this way in any kind of relationship that any human finds meaningful. There's always almost like an exception, even in situations where you're the CEO of a company, you wouldn't, unless you're a horrible person, you wouldn't treat your spouse or your children or your friends or your parents or whatnot in the same way as you would treat your employees, for example, or at least you know what I mean. And this is something that is quite interesting. I've dedicated a number of episodes, maybe too many, to think about this, partly what Mark Fisher called capitalist realism, and is this idea that there are no alternatives. And because of that, it goes back to this thing I said before of as in the dominant structure of a society has the answer, or has an answer that it wants, or the economists or the politicians, the decision makers, whatnot, want to have, and they're trying to square that circle, and they're trying to fit everything within that. And given that it doesn't work, on a basic, almost like on a physical level, then the strategy essentially right now is at least it feels like it's a combination of denial and delaying, essentially, and maybe even minimizing the threats that we're facing. Okay, I think we will slowly wrap up this conversation. I will ask if it's okay for both of you to maybe Yusra first to reflect a bit on this conversation, what you got out of it, and even maybe more personally, you can tell folks where they can find you, what are the things that you want to that you are working on or that you will work on in the future. And Timothée, after Yusra, if it's okay, you can do the same. And also, I end by asking guests to recommend 3 books, so we can do that as well.
Yeah, so I've got a website, timotheeparrique.com, where I'm trying to gather all the stuff I've been doing before, all the stuff I write. Otherwise, you can find me on Twitter at Tim Parrique, on Instagram at Timothée Parrique, on LinkedIn at Timothée Parrique, and I'm trying as best as I can to display the stuff I do on these platforms. Right now, I will be doing many events in French because my book in France was quite popular. We've just been over 30,000 copies, so that's very good news for a book in French about degrowth. It's called Ralentir ou périr l'économie de la décroissance, Slow Down or Perish the Economics of Degrowth. So I'll continue to do this, and then I've got a few academic articles that will soon come out, hopefully this year. One on decoupling in Europe, the one I've presented at the Parliament, and another one even more exciting on how to finance public services during a period of degrowth. So I'll be working hard on these stuff. And for the books, I've got a little gem I was just thinking of. It's the translation of a French novel that was published in 2017. And the title is in English, is A Journey Through Misery, an essay to rebuild everything. You can find the PDF for free on the Anarchist Library. And it's a novel, it's a utopian novel written by a law professor at a university here in France. And so typical utopian novel, the guy just flies over to a conference in Australia, the plane crashes, and the guy finds himself in Arcadia, an 80 million country people that have implemented a system of government called misarchy. Misarchy means, the hatred of power. So it's a nice little degrowth-oriented post-capitalist anarchist economy. And because the guy is a law professor, like the institutions he talks about, like the melting property prices and specific, labor contract in cooperatives, is so precise. It is outstanding how interesting that thing is. It is so interesting, the world that guy's created, that I'm actually writing an academic article called, Educating Our Desire for Post-Capitalist World, the Economics of Misery. So I'm actually describing the economic system of that novel as if it really existed, because I think it could. That's my first book, a novel, chilled for the summer. Then if you want to do a bit of work, The Future is Degrowth. It came out last summer, written by top scholars in the field. It's my favorite introduction, like review of the degrowth literature. If you read this, you will know it all. It's full of lists. It's so well organized. And then, of course, there's Jason Hickel, Less is More, which is my absolute favorite to go into the topic of degrowth. If you want a well-written, riveting book, you can read that one first, and maybe then if you want to know more about the scholarly depth of the concept, then you can switch to The Future is Degrowth.
Amazing. Thanks a lot, Timothée. Yusra, you with us? No, she's not.
We lost her completely.
I think she went to work stuff. It's okay. It's okay. We know this happens on this podcast. We have to just adapt. It's not a problem.
See, those are the risk of the trade.
Yeah, it is what it is. It's okay. Well, okay, Timothée, thanks a lot for doing this. Honestly, this was a fascinating conversation. I'm sure listeners would agree. And Yusra, when you do hear this, thanks a lot for joining us. And sorry we can have you in the end, but as we said, these things happen. But anyway, thanks a lot, Timothée.
Thank you so much for the invite. See you next time.
The Fire These Times is hosted by myself, Joey Ayoub. I am also its producer, researcher, writer, and sound editor. If you want to help turn this project into a full-time job, please head out to patreon.com/FarEastTimes to support it. These episodes are part of a bigger project which includes resources, a newsletter, and eventually YouTube video essays as well. As always, thank you for listening and take care.